Hail thee well, and welcome all. I'm the Jake of all trades, and today we're talking about railroads versus sandboxes. Hey everybody, so I've been wanting to make this video for a while, and originally it was going to be just railroads versus sandboxes, but the more that I was writing out and thinking about this topic, these two different styles of game, the more I realized that there was quite a bit that needed to be said. So originally this was going to be a pretty short video. I apologize if it ends up being something a little bit longer than that. Hopefully we'll just you'll stick with me and we'll get this figured out together. When I say railroad or a railroad style game, in my opinion, what I am referring to is a game that is heavily story driven, a game that focuses primarily on the story, that is in the background essentially, that it encompasses like everything essentially. And as a result, because the game focuses so much on the story, the events that happen, they can appear at first glance to be somewhat linear as they are deployed from, one to the next to the next. But I'll get into that more later. It's not quite as linear as it sounds at first glance. Sound. I don't know. Anyway, and also typically they have a set length. They have an established length to the arc. There, it extends for 1 level or 5 levels or 10 levels or 20 levels. However many levels, typically there's an arc, a level arc, like a length to the campaign that goes with this story as well. And now let's contrast that against the sandboxes. So sandboxes, in my opinion, they are mostly player driven. With the railroad games, it's about the story, but in a sandbox game, it's all about the players. As a result, your linear progression of events kind of resembles more of like a spider web with, each direction leading to, another web of, possible directions and possible outcomes. And so it looks a lot more like just a very intricate web of possibilities that might unfold. And the length of a sandbox game, pretty much it doesn't depend on the story at all, really. It depends on the players and it depends on the game master. It depends on the people sitting around the table, absolutely. I mean, certainly it depends on that for railroad games as well, but, in just a general terms, assuming that everyone wants to play, the railroad lasts as long as the story lasts, whereas the sandbox lasts as long as people want to keep playing. Now, this is the main reason I wanted to make this video. So please, if you don't listen to anything else I say in this whole video, please listen to this, because I feel like this is actually really important, and this is something a lot of people I don't think they realize this when they're talking about a sandbox game or a railroad game. It's not black and white. It's not just railroad or sandbox. There is an entire spectrum of games in between the railroad and in between the sandbox, and depending on how much control you give to your players and other factors within that and how you run your game, then your game is going to slide on that. It might lean more towards the sandbox end of things. If you allow your players to direct the story, you give them like total autonomy to go pretty much and do whatever they want, that is pretty much as close to a true sandbox style game as you can get. Whereas if you don't allow a lot of that control to your players, if they start out, if you're like, hey, we're gonna run, this adventure that I just picked up, it sounds really cool, and all the players sign up for it, and they're stuck in that adventure until they finish it essentially. Obviously if they wanted to try to get out of it in game, there's probably ways that they could do that, but I'm working with the assumption that the players are gonna want to finish this stuff at least once they start it. But like an adventure module like that, it has an outcome. It has something, good or something bad that could happen, and that's going to be more of a railroad. It's like the end result is already kind of written down. It's just a matter of how you get there and whether it's a yes or a no. So that's the thing. It's not black and white. There's shades of gray, many shades in between those two end markers. So that is really important, and I don't think a lot of people realize it. if you don't have a lot of control over where the story is going as a player, you're in a railroad style game. If you are telling the game master where you are going and what you are doing, you're probably in more of a sandbox style game. Those are kind of ways to look at it, because no game is 100% sandbox or 100% railroad. They all fall in the middle somewhere, and it's just a matter of where. And most of the time these days, they fall over on the sandbox end of things. That's what people are kind of into, I feel like, and I enjoy them as well. They're a lot of fun. We need to talk about the needs of your game. What kind of game are you running? If you're running a railroad style game, or you want to run a railroad style game, you are going to need a very compelling story. That is right off the bat something that a lot of people, they kind of figure that, oh yeah, I need a good story for this adventure, you know, something that my players are going to be invested in and want to see through. That is absolutely true, but the thing a lot of other people don't think about is that you also need really compelling characters. You need lots of compelling NPCs who are going to also, that'll be, you know, that's the thing. People think that the adventure and the gold and the experience is going to be enough to encourage the players to do this thing. But a lot of the times the players are like, man, this is crazy. Why would I want to do this? What is the reason? I don't care about these people. It's like, well, that's why you need to make them care. A lot of times the characters, the compelling NPCs fall by the wayside, and people lose interest in the game. The players lose interest, and that's the worst thing that can happen. So if you want to really hook your players for your railroad, you need a compelling story, and you need compelling characters. You need people to populate that story who are going to sympathize with your players and who your players are going to sympathize with. And you want to buy people that your players are going to hate too, because that, you know, you just want to get them riled up, because that gets them invested. You know, oh, I hate that guy. We can't let him get a hold of that ancient sword. Otherwise, you know, I mean, for no other reason than that guy's just kind of a dick. Like, we don't want him to have that sword. So, railroads, you need compelling stories, compelling characters. Now, with a sandbox, on the other hand, you need kind of another different set of things. You need, instead, to have a very fleshed out world. You need a very, very detailed world with lots of stuff in it, because in a sandbox, you don't know where your players are going to go. That one is, yeah, that's pretty basic knowledge. Another thing, though, that you need for a sandbox game that a lot of people don't bring up or they don't talk about, you don't know where your players are going to go, you don't know who they're going to be talking to, you don't know what they're going to be doing necessarily, even as you sit down for sessions some nights. And for that reason, you also want to have some really fine-honed improvisation skills. You want to be able to make stuff up on the fly pretty easily and pretty comfortably, and the more fleshed out your world is, and the more familiar you are with the world that you are playing in, the easier this is going to be. So if you put in that time before the game even starts to thoroughly read up on your campaign settings so that you know what is going on, or if you're inventing it, to just make sure that you think through all of the different angles and venues that you have proposed when you are creating your world, so that you know before the player asks the question what the answer is going to be. That's what you're looking for right there. That's the epitome. Now that you have an idea of what you need to run each of those styles of games, let's talk about some of the limitations of those styles of game. A railroad style is limited by the track. I mean, pretty straightforward stuff there. The story only goes as far as the track has been laid down for it. Its decisions tied to the story end up being much narrower in a railroad style game because of this. Also, you know, because the story has a set direction and it has an end place in mind, then the decisions that the players get to make and the stuff that they get to do in the game is a little bit narrower. The places, you know, they get to decide what to do or who to go after or this or that. A lot of times they can end up being kind of narrow because you need the story to go in this specific direction as soon as it hits like this point in the story, and that can be frustrating for players sometimes. And yeah, the game only lasts as long as the story lasts. As soon as your story is over, that's kind of the end of that game, unless you make up more story. So you just have to keep a building track if you want to keep that story going. Now, a sandbox, on the other hand, is kind of limited on the other hand. You know, the railroad is tied to the track. The sandbox is limited because of its freedom, really. It's limited in its freedom. A pure sandbox, you just drop your players off in the middle of a world, and it can be overwhelming, especially if you've got a big world and they don't have any direction, they don't have anywhere to go, they don't have any quests to pick up, they don't have anything to do. They're not going to know what to do. They're not going to have any clue. They're going to feel directionless and unsure of themselves and what they should be doing because there's nothing in front of them. So that is one of the downsides to a sandbox. The other downside is that there's a lot of pressure on the game master to know pretty much everything about the world. There's a lot of weight on them to have all of the facts down so that when they are asked about something, they are able to respond quickly and correctly. Alright, so you're finally ready. You finally decided. What are you going to run, a railroad or a sandbox? That's up to you. If you're going to run a railroad, though, here's a couple things. You want to focus on the players more than anything. Because there's a loss of player agency within a railroad-style game, you want to look for every opportunity for the players to influence the story as possible. And you want to try to create those opportunities for your players as well. Because the players are tied to the story, and there's not a lot of direction and freedom of choice, you want to give them that choice. You want to give them at least an illusion of that choice. Even if the choices are somewhat inconsequential, you want them to feel like they have meaning, that they were meaningful decisions that they made. That is going to be your main challenge in running a railroad-style game. You want to focus on the players. Another thing that you want to focus on, and this is going to help integrate your players into the game and get them interested and invested in the game. You want to focus on the interpersonal story arcs between your players and your NPCs. You want your players to write up their backstories, and you want to be mining those backstories for NPCs that you can be bringing in later, because these are ways to influence the player's story from their eyes, from their point of view, without influencing the story as greatly from the larger perspective. So you want to do that. You create meaningful relationships with the NPCs and the players. That's going to really help invest your players and bring them into it and get them on board for something that they might not otherwise be interested in. A good example of this, there was one NPC in my Avatar game that was very, very cool. When I introduced that character, I introduced them in a very cool fashion, and every time they encountered that person from then on, she was always doing super cool, badass stuff. And it was really cool. It was someone that the players could rely on in times of need, in times of combat and stuff. They could rely on this NPC to show up for them, and they had a strong bond with this NPC. And it made it a lot more powerful when that NPC forced one of the players in a situation to do something that player didn't want to do. And it created a very interesting session. I'm not sure yet if it was a really good session or a weird, not good session. I think it was a good one, but I don't know. I was trying to force my players into a difficult situation by pitting two NPCs against each other, essentially, and it was a matter of taking sides. And it didn't really influence the story at all, but it at all, really. It didn't have anything to do with the larger campaign in anything, really. It was just a matter of finding something interesting, an interesting scenario or encounter to put one of my players through so that they would feel more like this was a real place and they would feel like their decisions held some actual weight. Now let's contrast that with running a sandbox-style game. In a sandbox game, instead of focusing on the players and their relationships with the NPCs to draw them into the world, you're going to try to focus on dungeons and artifacts and villains. I mean, pretty much you want to focus on quest hooks and MacGuffins, essentially. That's going to be the stuff, because that is the stuff that is missing in a sandbox game. In a railroad game, the player freedom to choose what they do is missing, and so you have to supplement that as best as you can. But in a sandbox game, when you are missing direction and just and where to go is the real question, and what to do, that is what you need to focus on. You need to come up with the cool stuff for your players to go out and do. You need to come up with different quest hooks. Adventure boards or quest boards are a great way to do this. That's how I started my sandbox game. They're all in a tavern, they meet up, they join forces, and they take a look at the local quest board, which leads them on a couple quests where they start making some coin and making a name for themselves, that sort of thing. And now they're lords of a castle, and they are trying to take down Lord Saxton. That is, we just finished the siege of Castle Rend, and it was quite a bit of fun, and I'm really excited to see where the campaign is going to go now. That's the cool thing about a sandbox, is that you just present them with these adventures, with these quests, and when they pick them up, it ends up influencing the entire game. Like I was talking about that spider web earlier, it goes in different directions, and so they decide to pick up this quest over here. Well, that leads to another list of, another set of, choices that they can make, and where are they going to go from there? It leads to another one, and it's just this whole complex web, and pretty soon the webs, the strands start crossing with each other, and you didn't even plan on that happening. It just sort of happens. You want to focus on cool quests, cool villains, just cool stories for your players to engage in. That's what you want to do in a sandbox, because they don't have that direction. They don't have something, you telling them that they need to go this way, or that sort of thing. You need to give that to them. You need to give them options so that they can explore. That's what you need. So, in conclusion, no game is 100% railroad or sandbox. It's a slider scale, and games fall in the middle somewhere. Depending on what kind of game you're running, a railroad or a sandbox, your game is going to have different needs. A railroad game needs a lot of characters, a lot of NPCs for your characters and players to interact with, and you need to focus on the player decisions in that game. For a sandbox game, you need a really fleshed out world, and you need to know that world really well, and you also need to be able to improv pretty consistently, pretty well on the spot. Now, your game's going to have different limitations depending on which one you're playing. If you're playing a railroad game, your game is going to be limited by the track, by the story, essentially. And so it's up to you to find any decisions within those tracks that your players can make, and try to put emphasis on those for your players. In a sandbox-style game, it's limited by its freedom, and the players might feel directionless and unsure if they don't have interesting stuff in front of them to do. And so it's your job then, in a sandbox, to make sure that you have some interesting stories and plot hooks set up for your players to try to go out on, some fun quests for them to accomplish, that sort of thing. Alright? And then running your game. If you're going to be running a railroad game, you want to focus on the players and the personal story arcs with the players and the NPCs. That's going to help bring your players into the game. In a sandbox game, you want to focus on those plot hooks. You want to focus on the things that are going to bring them in. They're going to be writing their characters and writing their story. It's up to you to decide where that story is. I mean, it's up to them, but you got to write that stuff, right? So, yeah. All right. That's pretty much it, I think, for this episode. It's kind of a long one. Sorry about that. In my next episode, or down the road, I'm probably going to do a video at some point on just strictly railroads, because I think there's a lot of stuff that I need to say about this game, the style of game, that I don't feel like I was able to fit in this video. I want to talk about how you can plot out a railroad style game, and how you can prepare for your sessions while you're running a railroad game, and how to implement your sessions, how to actually enact them. And here's the thing, spoiler alert, they look a lot like sandboxes when they are being implemented correctly, I believe. Because that's the thing, the railroad aspect is only in terms of like the point A to point B. Everything in between should be kind of malleable. It should be able to change depending on where the players are going and what they're doing. And if you are preparing correctly, it shouldn't be any problem for your players to feel like they had complete control over the game the entire time, even though you knew exactly where they were going and what they were doing. But that's all for a later video. for right now, I thank you all so much for listening, and I certainly hope that I'm going to see you again very soon.